Welcome everyone, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Anyone that's late can just join as they come on. Welcome to our webinar on Internationalising Your Wealth for Protection. So before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of this session. You're more than welcome to pop messages as and when you please, and we'll address them at the very end. Before we get started, just to introduce all of us, my name is Jade Kramer. I'm from Holborn Assets. I'm a senior associate, and I'm joined by Matthew Turon, who is just on the screen there. We are also very happy and pleased to introduce John Oerdendal from Corpag, as well as Rex Cowley from Overseas Trusts and Pensions, as well as David Noon from Capital International Group. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your time. So just a bit of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about tonight. Many investors have been looking at options for their wealth to defend yourself against local political risk, institutional risk, rand depreciation, as well as the looming possibility of prescribed assets. The constraints that we currently face with regards to Regulation 28, as well as forced repatriation of funds and the possibility of a new wealth tax have all been questions that we have been asked.
Those seeking true offshore exposure and protection through offshore pensions and trusts have historically always been discouraged by your local companies and advisors, sometimes to their own benefit, in favor of SA-based offshore investments, which lack many of the benefits and protective features of holding your assets and wealth offshore in a more stable and robust tax-efficient jurisdiction.
Yes, indeed. So, Johan, if we could ask you a question, you're obviously an expert when it comes to taking money offshore, as well as, the areas involved in this. Why are people looking to move their money offshore? What are some of the benefits?
Thanks, Jade. I think you've already mentioned a few of the benefits that are specific to South Africa, including potential rand depreciation, political risk, etc. But from a general perspective, wealthy families, entrepreneurs, and business people look at offshore trusts for various reasons, including the fact that it provides a very high layer of asset protection. So all of the assets that are placed within the offshore trust are basically ring-fenced. So that means personal creditors cannot make any claims against those assets. Offshore trusts are also used quite a lot for family wealth and succession planning. So if you've got quite an internationalized family with children and grandchildren that have got plans to move overseas, perhaps to study or whatever the case may be, offshore trusts can very well be used to provide maintenance and funding for them on that side. Offshore trusts also help to avoid complex probate processes, so what we know as winding up of estates in South Africa, and also forced heirship rules in certain countries. Because of the fact that the assets in the offshore trusts are outside of your personal estate, there is also the aspect of estate duty savings. And then just from a general perspective, if you do have these structures in place, it gives you access to global financial markets and services. And that's a thing that a lot of South Africans are looking for at the moment because of the lack of options and because of the growth opportunities that do lie abroad.
Okay, Rex, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, we understand why many people do go offshore. So what are some of the considerations around, internationalizing of one's wealth, and what are some of the pitfalls?
I think, if I say there was a very interesting statistic that came out recently, the Capgemini World Wealth Report, where it looks at countries around the world and looks at asset exposure. And if you look at South Africa, the report suggests that South Africans typically only have 12% of their wealth exposed to international assets. Now, we know why this is. It's because we've had exchange control for very, very many years. and everyone's been relatively happy with the performance of the JSE over, since 1971 kind of thing onwards. So there has really not been much of an opportunity to go offshore, and people have been happy with their returns. And I think, that's led to this disparity. But I also think that, people, particularly South Africans, are starting to realize the importance to become an international citizen. We see ourselves as South African citizens, but the world's changed. Borders are there, but are they there in terms of how we operate as people? There are more people mobile today than ever before, and wealth is more mobile than ever before. And South Africans have been missing out on that. So this concept of, if you internationalize your wealth, it allows you to participate on the global stage. In other words, where we see, or if we see rand depreciation happening, you are becoming poorer in terms of your international buying power, not necessarily your South African buying power, but your international buying power. And retaining international buying power is important because it gives you the ability to exercise your own discretion as what you want to do. Do you want to travel? Do you want to go and live abroad? You have to have the financial means to do that. So therefore, hedging in terms of rand depreciation is very important, but also accessing companies such as, the Microsofts and the Googles, as opposed to those that are listed on the JSE, is very important. So you've got that concept of asset, I almost want to call it wealth preservation. To internationalize your funds helps you to preserve your global buying power as a global citizen. And as we're seeing that theme play out as South Africans start to internationalize. But as you say, internationalizing wealth does have some things that you need to think about, and Johan did point to them, and a lot of South Africans have taken that first step. They have taken money offshore. It's in a bank account or it's in an investment, and they've done those first two very important steps in terms of accessing foreign assets and holding hard currency. The question is, what's the next steps that you need to do to sort of make that wealth portable, and also protect yourselves from the cross-border issues that now come into play? Cross-border, very simple. I sit in this country, my wealth sits in another country, I have a cross-border issues. I'm crossing over the line. And there we've got to consider some of those things that Johan spoke about. If you have assets in a foreign country, what happens when you die? Your South African will only has any authority within the boundaries of South Africa. It doesn't mean it's a valid will in Germany or the UK or the US. And as Johan also alluded to, what are the rules of probate in those countries? In other words, when you pass away and those assets get passed to somebody, what do the laws of that country say? Does a certain person have to get it? Can it only be done in certain percentages? And of course, what's the taxation on those assets? So a lot of people are internationalizing, but they're not considering probate, they're not considering cross-border taxation and other cross-border legislation. So they really aren't thinking about it until it becomes too late. So I think the concept of what structure do you put that in becomes important. And whether you're using an international trust or an international pensions, these vehicles mitigate all of those cross-border or border matters. So very, very important for administration efficiency and to mitigate those things. So there are some pitfalls by going offshore or internationalizing, and it's very important to get the advice so that you can consider probate, succession, and of course foreign taxation as part of that. But people are taking that first step, Matthew.
That's great. Thank you, Rex. While we have you, there's always been a bit of a debate around offshore pensions. But recently, Judge Dennis Davis came out saying that you can use these so long as they are seen as a bona fide pension. What exactly does this mean to the average person, and what is the biggest difference, would you say, as to why a person would opt for an offshore pension versus obviously all the things we've just mentioned, but an SA-based trust or pension?
Okay, I think the first thing is your offshore pension is there to hold international assets. It's not there to hold South African assets. Okay, so it's an addition to the portfolio of, I would say, of financial products that an individual will have. So a South African will probably have his RA, pension scheme, investments in that locally. But if you want to then start holding those assets internationally, you should consider also the right structure to hold those assets to ensure that they're efficient. So where people want to internationalize, an international pension is a good vehicle because of the asset protection and that it gives you, and it also gives you a level of tax efficiency in the same way as your domestic pension gives you asset protection and a level of tax efficiency. What I think it was very interesting to see the comments made by the retired judge Dennis Davis, but that was sort of more in his capacity, as a consultant to the revenue services, and he talks about legitimate offshore pensions, and I think if you follow a lot of the work that he's done over the years, what he's really referring to there is sort of twofold. There's the obvious that the pension scheme that you must be using probably should be legitimate. In other words, it must be issued by an authority and regulated by an authority as a pension in the country in which it's issued. But he's more alluding to the fact that from a South African point of view, it must be seen as a foreign pension. And because ultimately it's South African law that applies to the people that are using them if they are South African. So it's that context that's important. And I think what he's referring to there is to do with the substance and the form of the vehicle. And over the years, he has often cautioned the use of structures which disguise the intent of that vehicle. So if you're trying to use an international pension to sort of achieve unfair tax advantages or result in base erosion or profit shifting, I think if you read between the lines, he's saying that won't be tolerated. But if you're using a pension scheme to provide for retirement, that's a totally different matter. And in the same way that we've seen trusts being used for different purposes and resulting in abuse. So I think really what he's saying is a bona fide pension scheme that is used for creating a pot of wealth that's internationalized for retirement purposes makes good sense. If you're trying to use it to achieve another outcome, which you're trying to disguise from the tax office, that can't be tolerated. I think the other point that he pointed to was the caution that people should be careful that the international pension is nothing more than a normal investment, and this is a very important point. And we have a lot of people that might hold, for example, tax efficient UK savings vehicles. They might be tax efficient in the UK, but it doesn't mean they're tax efficient here. Remember, it's so it's that point. And I think we often see individuals who will be in pension schemes, foreign pension schemes, but the pension scheme gives the member the full control over the assets and allows them to direct the pension trustees. So in those circumstances, and if you consider South African law, you will find some great cases. Badenhorst versus Badenhorst is a really good example of control of assets. If you're actually controlling those assets, then they actually belong to you. And if they belong to you, then you need to be paying tax on the gains and the income that are arising from those. So in other words, you have nothing more than a savings vehicle from a South African point of view. Internationally, yes, it might be a pension, but how does it get translated from a South African point of view? And I think it's a very good point that he raised, which is cautioning people, which is really coming down to the point that it's a little bit more complex than you might think. So probably go and get some advice on the structure, how it operates, and how you intend to use it. And if you do all of those things and you do it properly, then crack on and use them.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Rex. So, Johan, if we could then pose the question to you then. So if that's pensions and offshore pensions, why now trusts, and specifically offshore trusts? How are they different and how do they work?
Thanks, Matthew. I think I would start by saying that offshore trusts are a very bespoke and personalized type of offshore structure. I think it does allow for a lot more flexibility than, for instance, an offshore pension would. For instance, you can appoint family members, children, friends, whomever as beneficiaries of an offshore discretionary trust. So basically, anyone that you appoint as beneficiary can share in the benefits that arise out of those assets. And the other aspect is the fact that an offshore trust is a lot more flexible in terms of the type of asset that it can actually legally own. So when you set up an offshore trust, you're not confined to for instance, it only being able to hold financial assets or alike. You can put properties that are located abroad in there, movable, immovable property. You can put valuable pieces of artwork, etc. So it's very much a personalized legal structure that you can use to own assets that are located in various different places across the world, and those assets are managed by the trustees for the benefit of the specific beneficiaries that you as the settlor have appointed, irrespective of where they are located.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, a question for David. David, this is obviously your area of expertise when it comes to the investment side of things. What exactly do you need to consider when investing offshore? What advantages are there in investing offshore?
Great question. Before we get on offshore, let's talk about onshore. I think there's nothing wrong with having onshore, and we all have onshore through our pensions and our savings that we just grow locally. It's more about restrictions of onshore. You're in, SA providers, SA products, SA regulation. And when I look at the advantages of offshore, I call it investing without borders. So why restrict yourself to a geographical location when you can have the world? Open architecture, unrestricted investment choices. It's out there. Why not have access to it? Investing across multiple assets. So, equities, collectives, but not only, local ones, global ones. And then multiple currencies is the next step. Hard currency, as I call it, your dollars, your euros, your sterling, can help reduce the volatility. We know the rand is an emerging currency, and volatility can impact it quite significantly. And then it drills down to diversification. You're diversifying your portfolio and your holdings, which then allows you to reduce risk within your total portfolio, but also gain exposure to hard currency returns, which is all an advantage when you're investing. To summarize, I think it's a balance. We'll grow a local portfolio through our pension or through our savings from our salaries. It's then taking that step to say, look, I want to have an offshore plan because, living in South Africa, we always talk about doomsday and bringing money back and are we going to be the next Zimbabwe? So it's kind of a plan for the future. Don't be in that position where you haven't planned. And, when I first came to South Africa in 2008, the allowances were very small. Everybody can invest now. You've got your foreign investment allowance, your discretionary allowance. It used to be the wealthy invested offshore. Everybody's got access to it now. And I think, take advantage of that and plan for the unexpected.
Thank you for that, David. It was something that you mentioned earlier. Not many people may know or be aware of that sort of thing. You called, or you referred to the doomsday sort of, scenario or event often, spoken of in investment. And that there, I think many people, when you think of that, they think in terms of forced repatriation of funds, having your money forcibly brought back to South Africa against your will. Perhaps Rex, Johan, maybe you can comment on that. What sort of protection would you have in that sort of scenario? Do your offshore pensions, offshore trusts, jurisdiction, what sort of jurisdiction would a South African court, for example, SARS, have over your assets abroad in such a scenario? Perhaps, Johan, if we can pose that to you first.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think it's not so much a question of which jurisdiction. It's more a question of how the actual trust is set up and how the actual trust is managed on a day-to-day basis. As long as the offshore or international trust remains fully discretionary, i.e., the trustees retain the control or the power to make decisions regarding the assets and managing those assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries, then that structure should generally be recognized as a trust for South African purposes. So it's all about the actual substance and not about the form of the structure.
Rex, anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I think if a doomsday scenario, yes, could the government issue a forced repatriation of assets? Well, we've seen it happen in Kenya. So a government is at liberty to change its laws as it sees fit because it's a sovereign state. So the government can effectively do what it wants within its constitutional rights or powers. I'm highly unlikely, I would say, given current government policy. And we are seeing a constant relaxation and an expected significant change to the exchange control rules over the coming months. So that kind of an action would be probably very unexpected. But under different circumstances with a different party politics, you could find you in that kind of a situation. I think on that point, where you're using an international structure, and as Johan alluded to, as long as it is a genuinely non-resident structure that is located in another country that's subject to the laws of that country, one country can't impose its laws on another. So if your assets are sitting, well, basically, if you put your assets into a trust or a pension, they effectively belong to the trust or the pension and not you, and you are simply a beneficiary of those structures. So you don't have legal ownership of the asset that sits with your pension or your trust. So the concept of forced repatriation would be very difficult under those conditions, compared to whether you had cash in a bank account overseas. It probably, under those conditions, you probably would be forced to bring your funds back. In Kenya, I suppose the interesting point there is an awful lot of people have bricks and mortar. So how do you bring back your apartment in Mayfair back to Kenya? You can't. So there's practicalities around that as well. But I suppose the point is your trusts or your pensions, they give you a significant degree of asset protection to protect you from those kind of catastrophe events. But as you know, my view is, I think we've had a question actually coming up on exchange control, is that I think South Africa really is trying to internationalize in a number of ways. It has to encourage investment into the country, and if it can encourage investment out of the country, which will allow people to actually grow the wealth base, that's good for the tax base, because you're starting to grow your assets in hard currency as opposed to rands, and it doesn't mean it's not subject to tax. It might mean it's subject to more tax, but that'll be because you've had better gains. So practicalities. I think practicality is very difficult to impose such kind of legislation on foreign trusts and pensions. I can't see that actually happening.
Okay, David, one of the other things you mentioned was open architecture globally. Now, a lot of the time when I'm speaking to clients, specifically either in South Africa or even offshore, I tend to find myself having to always describe them, when being either honest or nice to them, as them having all their eggs in one basket. Surprisingly enough, it happens with the majority of clients. If you're going to diversify across different asset classes, geographic regions, then why not also diversify in terms of how that property or asset is held, whether it's in your own name or having some of it not in your name through an offshore pension or trust. But when it comes to open architecture, what does that really mean? How does that really help someone, if they've diversified in their own name and now they have a structure outside of South Africa? How does that open architecture outside of South Africa look as opposed to what we have, inside South Africa? David, to you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So just as an example, so we are the platform provider and we've got 7,000 funds available on our platform. So if you compare that, this is just our funds. I'm not talking about the thousands and thousands of shares available through the platform. Comparison to what's available in South Africa, it's kind of comparing a pond to an ocean. So that's kind of the best analogy. It's, do you want to restrict yourself to fishing in that pond, or do you want to fish in the ocean? that is kind of the easiest way to explain it in a very short description. It's kind of, you know, you go to the buffet, the buffet breakfast. Why just have the cereal? You want to have everything.
Exactly, and that's a brilliant analogy. Really good. Thank you for that. Well, I don't want to keep everyone up for too long. So, as is evidence from obviously the wealth of expertise here this evening, you know, internationalizing your wealth and going offshore is a good idea. It's a very good idea, in fact, but it isn't as simple as you might think. As David said, you know, the pond versus the ocean. You know, in reality, there are already some people who have gone offshore and may actually have exposed themselves to a lot of problems they aren't even aware of. Some of the things that was mentioned earlier by panelists, things such as, you know, a probate. We also touched on a succession and wealth taxes. So here you have the ideal opportunity to consolidate, you know, those assets offshore into either a trust or a pension scheme, and then, you know, take things further.
Yeah, I think if I could jump in there, I was going to say, I think obviously getting advice around all of that is critical, because there's always more to it than meets the eye. Yeah, I think the advice bit is the critical bit at this point. And don't try and do it yourself, because the world is actually incredibly complex. And whilst I love David's analogy of the pond versus the ocean, it's a lot more difficult to navigate the ocean than it is the pond, but the rewards are there. So yeah, I think getting that advice and don't trying to do it yourself is very important.
I agree. Thank you for that, Rex. I mean, we did briefly mention exchange control. I see we had a question on that. Not sure if anybody would like to address that question, but with regards to obviously getting your money outside of South Africa into a hard currency, into international markets in a legitimate way, as Rex just mentioned, it is extremely complex, and you do want to make sure that the actual structure of the vehicle is, you know, completely above board and is robust, because there's no point in going from, you know, South Africa and then taking money offshore, not structuring it correctly. So I think, you know, the advantages stand when it comes to the structure of your investment, as well as then looking at, as David mentioned, the actual investments when you are offshore. So yeah, so the question I think that we had was around the 10 million discretionary allowance, and when they think that we are going to be able to get, you know, when they're going to relax this. Does anyone have any idea when that's going to happen? There has been murmurs of that.
I think if you put the Exchange Control sort of Act into context, actually the way the Act is written is there is a prohibition on sending money outside of the country. So that's how the law stands. And there are some allowances that are being made. These aren't rights, they're allowances that are given to people. And of course, those allowances can be taken back at any point in time. So we actually coming from a very constrained, conservative point. So to get to a point of significant flexibility, it's actually a very long way to travel. Saying that, we are seeing steps that have been taken. I suppose the fact that loop structures will now be permitted. And a lot of people talk about loop structures have been abolished. No, they haven't been abolished. They're just being permitted, subject to an awful lot of criteria and conditions being met. And that's great for companies. You know, great for companies, doesn't have terribly much application for private clients, but very, very good for companies. So I think, and I think if you look at the work that went into in terms of removing the prohibition on loops, it was significant. It wasn't just in considering the exchange control mechanics. It was also, for what I would say for the first time, considering the taxation alongside that. So all credit to the people that worked on that. So we've seen really joined up thinking coming out of South Africa, which is really, really positive. So I expect we will see that kind of thinking slowly making its way through the system as exchange controls loosen. What that might look like, I hazard a guess, and how long that might take. There's lots of noise, but as I said, if it's approached in the same way that we've seen loops, it's going to be well thought through when we do get it. So I think we will probably see some form of loosening taking place. I think the key thing that the government doesn't want to happen, but through the loosening of exchange control is losing sight of funds. Because when you lose sight of funds, you also lose the ability to tax them. And that's not the intention. The intention is to give South Africans the opportunity to internationalize their wealth, but not at the disadvantage of the country. So I think there's a real balance to be had in making those changes to ensure that they don't inadvertently create a position where people can abuse things. But I think loops was a great step forward, and I expect we'll see more loosening over the coming months and years.
Johan, do you have anything to add to that in terms of looping?
Very much agree with what Rex has said. I mean, I think I'll be shooting myself in the foot if I were to speculate on when these allowances would be lifted or increased. But as Rex has said, I mean, we've seen a lot of good steps in that direction recently. We've seen steps showing us that we're moving away from the negative bias framework towards all cross-border transactions are allowable, subject to certain requirements being met, etc., etc. So I think it's just a case of us having to be patient and trust that the authorities will approach this with caution and do the right thing at the right time.
Absolutely. So Johan, here's another question that's come up, and this is although this is not a tax webinar, we also don't want to get dragged too much into the tax side of things, because that can be a webinar all on its own and also quickly make things become very technical. In layman's terms, without changing the whole context of the webinar, what are the capital gains tax benefits and estate duty ramifications on your investments in a trust?
Well, I wouldn't say that there are estate duty ramifications. I mean, if anything, it's
simplified.
Yeah, exactly. It's taking the assets that are within the trust without your personal estate. So basically alleviating any potential estate duty that may arise. As far as CGT is concerned, I mean, there definitely will be CGT considerations upon moving assets from your own name into the trust. And as and when the trust then eventually does decide to dispose of any of those assets, there may once again be CGT consequences. But those rules are extremely complex, and as you say, we'd be going down a rabbit hole if we started discussing any details at this stage.
Rex, do you have anything to add on that question?
I would say tax is always an important consideration with regards to financial matters, but one shouldn't really let the financial planning dog be wagged by the tax tail. And I think, we every year we have a budget, and every year the laws change. So the concept of tax planning is, in my mind, is quite a short-lived thing. You plan for this year, but what about next year? So I think it's all about making sure that your financial plan is in place and dealing with and understanding the implication of tax on your affairs, and knowing that will change from one year possibly to the next. Yeah,
I think, and this is what when I sometimes get asked the question, quite simply, I often say, look, 99% of my clients and the people who speak to me don't speak to me because of the tax benefits. They're looking for the benefits that open architecture gives them. They're looking for the ability to be able to keep assets or wealth in a primary currency, to be able to invest as and how and when they like. To be able to hedge their money against high inflation, to protect it from political risk, as well as then the devaluation or the depreciation of the rand. And when we take all of that into context, very often tax, yes, is very important, but it tends to sometimes become a minor consideration, against all the other things. As David said, if you're going to be swimming in the ocean, or navigating an ocean as regards to a pond, there are different benefits involved.
Yeah,
and tax is the smallest part of that.
And I think what people want to make sure that they don't end up doing is paying double tax. I mean, I think that is what you really want to avoid. So you want to make sure that you're paying your tax in the place where it's due, and you're avoiding double taxation, because that's something that's you just don't want to happen, because then you undermine everything that you're doing. So, but there's lots of obviously mechanisms available to specifically to ensure that you don't end up in that double tax position. And trusts and pensions often are very helpful in that environment, so that you mitigate the international side of taxation, and you only have to consider about tax in your home country. So, but yeah, double tax is the thing you need to actually plan for, to ensure that you don't get double taxed.
Yes, yeah. So there's another question, and I'm worried that this is going to become too much of a tax issue. So an anonymous question: can you peg the value of your estate with the value of a loan to a trust?
Unfortunately, Matthew, from my side, I think that's quite a specific question for a specialist tax advisor. So I can't answer that.
I do think that's the sort of question that one needs to look at a lot more than just, the types of assets that are being involved, the type of trust involved. It's quite a complex question, that one. And again, when it comes to the tax, it's not a simple yes or no a lot of the time. There's a lot of background information to consider. Okay, well, Jade, if you want to wrap this up, I see we've already close to our 40 minutes.
Yeah, I was just...
We'll get to all the questions, sorry. We will answer them offline afterwards.
Yeah, perfect. But thank you all so much. I mean, we did go through quite a bit, and we really do appreciate having, these amazing panelists. So thank you all so much for attending, and thank you to our attendees. We really appreciate it. If you've got any other questions, please feel free to pop us a message or an email. And also, if you haven't already, we did put up a bit of a poll. So if you could please answer those questions, it'll be interesting to see what everyone else says. Oh, I see that somebody's also asked if we have a tax expert that we could recommend. Absolutely, we're more than happy to do that. On a one-to-one basis.
Yeah, reach out to us afterwards. We will send follow-up emails to everyone that attended, and then you can, reach out and we'll put you in touch with some tax experts.
Yes, we're happy to sit down and do this on an individual basis, because we obviously understand everyone has different needs. But if that's about it, then I think we're almost ready to wrap up.
Rex, thank you so much for your time. Johan, thank you for being with us and joining us this evening. David, a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Matthew and Jade.
And I look forward to another webinar soon. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.